We have spent some time exploring the minor prophets. And that was what seemed to me a very productive conversation, a very productive study. But now we're going to pivot. We're going to pivot in a direction that I think is essential for us in our efforts to live faithfully as Christians. And that pivot is rooted in a need for us to take seriously how rapidly things have changed in our own culture. And then recalibrating the things that are most fundamental to us as believers. And looking again at what it would mean to live out the Christian life in relationship to all these changes. And in order to do that, what do you have to do? Well, you have to get clear about the things that are most important. And so Pastor Daniel and I are suggesting, commending, an exploration of this book. This is by N.T. Wright. So if you're not aware of Wright's work, let me tell you a little bit about who he is. One way to characterize his influence on contemporary Christian Protestantism, although he's had influence in Catholic circles, his influence has been identified by some as having the same magnitude as that of C.S. Lewis. Lewis, as you know, came along during the Second World War and produced any number of works, Christian writings, and talks that had a profound influence on English-speaking Protestantism. And in a similar fashion, and perhaps in a more subversive fashion, N.T. Wright is doing the same thing. What do I mean by that? C.S. Lewis was an English literature scholar, and he wrote and he published works that captured the Christian imagination and helped us have a glimpse of who God was and what God's up to. N.T. Wright is also a scholar, but Wright is a New Testament and early church scholar. And as a consequence, Wright is able to speak with considerable authority about what the Bible says. And as most of us know, the battle among many Protestants over the last 50 years has been over what does the Bible say. There's this assumption that the Bible's our starting point, and Wright says, you better believe it is. And the problem is we haven't been getting it right. We haven't been reading it correctly. We've missed some important things. Why did you miss them? Because you had a certain lens through which you were reading the scriptures, and in reading it that way, we missed some things that are vital. And so Wright comes to us as, and if I'm getting this wrong, correct me, but he is broadly evangelical. Though he's an Anglican and an Anglican bishop, in Britain, if you were to characterize the various families of Christians, you have Anglicans, you have Baptists, you have Methodists, you have some Lutherans, you have the Scottish Church and the Presbyterians, the Reformed group. But the Anglican Church is the established church. But among the established church, there's 3 different versions of Anglicans. There's what you might call High Church or Anglo-Catholic. Then you have the kind of Anglican Protestant Reformee traditionalists. And then you have the evangelical Anglicans. And truth be told, he talks like and thinks more like an evangelical than he does the other 2. So he speaks a language that we know, is my point. In other words, he's not going to be talking about things that we're not already familiar with, because he's broadly evangelical in his Christian orientation. And so that's very helpful. He is Oxford educated. He has served in some of the highest posts in the Anglican Church, for example, the Bishop of Durham. He has been a research fellow at Wycliffe Hall. That's where Pastor Daniel was educated. If you look at his CV, I love this point. You may want to look this up sometime. But if you look up N.T. Wright's CV, he has all these honorary doctorates. There's about 5 of them. Guess where his second honorary doctorate came from? The John Leland Center for Theological Studies, our school. Because he is on a book tour, and we were able, through the auspices of Daniel's connections back at Wycliffe Hall, to invite him to come and to speak to us about his book. And he and his publisher said, sure. Well, the funny thing about it was, when he got here, the Episcopal Seminary down the road, the Anglican Seminary, you might say, said, why didn't you come to us? Why did you come to Leland? And he said, because they invited me. And we did. We had 600 people there. It was fabulous. One of my favorite moments in my whole time at Leland was when I got to turn to Professor Wright and say, you do realize that your people in Virginia put my people in jail. He thought that was fun. He's got a great sense of humor. So my point is this is someone we can talk to. And not only is he someone we can talk to, he's someone who has captured, I think, the very essence of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And he is proclaiming, but he is re-articulating for us what it means and what that looks like in the 21st century. C.S. Lewis did it for us in the post-war era, and now Wright's doing it for the 21st century, the post-pandemic era. And it is extremely helpful. Now, that does not mean that we have to agree with Wright on every point of doctrine. We don't. And as Baptists, why would we? I mean, we have a lot of autonomy as Baptists to read the scriptures and understand them. But his voice is so clear. Now, you may get 2 chapters into this and you might say, well, it's not clear to me. That's okay. That's right. That's okay. But there are lots of things. What it does is has the potential to be very clear. And so this entire conversation over these next 6 or 8, 9 weeks, whatever it takes, is to try to get with Wright and understand what it is he's saying about what matters most Christianly. It's called Simply Christian. And the hope is that it speaks to what for him is the essence of the faith. You know, he conveys in here the story that when he was young, he came to the conclusion that God loved him enough to die for him. And that has been at the heart of everything for him. Not only him, but everyone. That God loved him enough to die for him. I think that's a good place to start. And so he has a structure in this book. And he begins at the introduction by talking about two kinds of travelers. There are travelers who, when they travel somewhere, they just like to go. And they kind of figure it out as they go along. And they enjoy each experience as they go along. My sister's like this. My sister will get in the car. She'll go down to where my mother lives. She'll pick her up. And they will go wandering. And they come back with the most beautiful stories of the things that they've encountered, the things that they've gotten up to, the things that they're doing, etc. And then there's the other kind of traveler. And that kind of traveler makes their way, but before they do so, they want a plan. They want to, looking at David, they want to know where they're going. They want to know what the destination is. They want to check the GPS in advance. They want an outline of how this is all supposed to work. Well, he says that that's what this book's meant to do, is to help give us a plan, or better yet, a kind of guide to where we're trying to get to. And so I quite like that. Now, he hopes that this book will entice, speak to those who are non-Christians about what Christianity is about. So he does have kind of an evangelistic expectation of this work, but he also expects this book to do a different kind of work as well. Not just for those who are outside the faith, but for those who are in the faith, it's meant to be a way of explaining the faith. And if you get a hold of it well enough, it'll even let you share that faith. But he does mean for it to be a kind of explanation. And he hopes it's sufficiently non-Anglican, non-Catholic, non-Protestant that it is, as he calls it, simply Christian. He's tried to boil it down as best he can. So that's all very positive. And so he begins by talking about he's got three different parts to this that he wants us to contend with. It's in three sections. The first section is called Echoes of Voices, or Echoes of a Voice. And in the first section, he identifies four different areas that he believes we hear echoes. And those echoes are things that cause us to pause or wonder or reflect or think about, is there something beyond me talking to me about what matters most? Is there something beyond me? And I'm going to articulate those in a minute. So that's the first section. In other words, do we have a reasonably good idea that there's something beyond us talking to us? Then the second part has to do with what you might call the central Christian beliefs. In other words, if you were to take those echoes and you were to get in on what it is that those echoes are trying to tell us or point us to. He calls them signposts. if we were to get on what those signposts, those echoes are pointing to, what we know are these things about Jesus and about God. So that's kind of the second chapter, the second section's on basic Christian beliefs. And then the third part is, if these beliefs are what we say they are, then what would that look like lived out in the life of any individual person? What would a life illumined by or animated by these sets of beliefs, what would that look like? What kind of life would you be talking about? So that's the third section. So the first part is kind of apologetic in the sense that he's trying to help us understand all the ways in which we might hear that God's got something to say. And then the second part's about, well, what is it that God says? And then the third part is, what would it look like if we lived the life about which God speaks? It's pretty simple. And so that's what's kind of at the heart of this study. So, echoes of a voice. He thinks there are four. We're not going to get into the book today because I'm going to share the book with you and you're going to go home and read it. We're going to talk about it next week. But I just want to kind of ask you about some things connected to preparing to read the book. He begins with a conversation about our longing for justice. That's where he starts. And I think that's fascinating. Because when you think about it, there are lots of ways in which all of us respond to the world in the following way. We see something going on, even as young children. We see something going on and we say, that's not right. That's not fair. That's not how things ought to be. We just have this reaction to the world. That's not right. That's not fair. Well, that's not how it's supposed to be. We have this reaction all the time. And so he begins to explore that reaction in the first chapter about this messed upness of things, this distortion of things, the twistedness that we find in the world. So he has conversation around that. Then he goes on to a topic of spirituality, what he calls the quest for spirituality. I continue to marvel that the groups that have taken responsibility for surveying American religiosity, like Pew and Lilly and Gallup, they keep coming back with these statistics that I marvel at, that namely, all these younger adults that we think are falling away seem to have as lively or livelier spirituality than the generation before them. Now, we might think that's counterintuitive. Wait a minute, they're the ones that ain't going to church. But the researchers are finding the spirituality among these young people is really high. And their sensibilities about justice are very high. And their awareness that life ought to have some profound meaning is high. And there's got to be something beyond just this. Is high.
Is it a majority of those types of people?
it's a higher percentage than the generation before.
What do we define spirituality? How do they define that?
Well, I'd have to get you the survey, and you'd have to read it and see how they, do the survey itself. But those areas that I mentioned about, the importance of a meaningful life as opposed to just one that achieves certain economic goals. Yeah. Please. You got to use the mic or it doesn't count, John. Pastor Daniel, get on me.
What Jeff said, you have to look at the survey, but in generally these surveys cover things like belief in a God or at least a higher power, belief that things in the world aren't random, that there is something behind it, prayer, other practices, spiritual practices, engagement with others. But it's important to note that these same surveys differentiate between spirituality, beliefs, and religiosity, which is church attendance, formal things like that. So.
Precisely. In other words, they make a distinction between religiosity and spirituality. So we have an entire generation who are questing, more than just a generation. But there's this deep questing going on that seems, it's been a part of human existence since we have recorded history, this kind of questing. It's just the levels of it seem to oscillate. And it's particularly high. A hunger for relationships. So remember what we're talking about, echoes of voices. Well, this recognition that things aren't right, this kind of questing in terms of a person's spiritual life, recognizing their spiritual life, recognizing they have a spiritual life. There's lively conversations about these things among younger adults. The hunger for relationships. Now, we've talked about that a little bit more here than we've talked about some of the others. And part of that's because in our community, we are experiencing pandemic levels of younger adults unable to make lasting relationships. I read a book some years ago called Excellent Sheep. I don't know if you've read that book, but it's by a guy who taught at Yale University. And it was a very moving book for me because as a professor, he says we could bring in these young adults into the university and we could ask them to do anything academically, and they would knock it out of the park. We'd give them Chaucer and they could translate it into contemporary English because they had those skills. Any hurdle we gave them, they were able to, with excellence, get over that hurdle or achieve X or Y. Whatever we put before them, they can do it. But he said, what they can't do is negotiate their own relationships. They have underdeveloped souls. They can't connect with other people. They're struggling to know how to do adulting. All of the things that qualify as, I hate to use the word maturing because it's a little broader than maturing. The soulful interplay of interpersonal relations is challenging for them. And this is a common phenomenon. This is not an anomaly. This is a common phenomenon in the Western world right now. Yes?
I have an example. A friend of mine is a middle school social worker, and she works in a school. There's a lot of young, new teachers. Mm-hmm. And so there was a student that they had an issue, and the social worker said, you need to call the parents and talk to them. And she said, I can't call the parents. And she said, yes, you can. She said, no, I can't. And so what she realized was that generation's not used to calling and talking to people. They're used to texting, emailing.
Sure.
So it was just really enlightening to realize that she was terrified to call the parents, and she did not call the parents.
Right. Now, hunger for relationships is universal among human beings. But what we're talking about here is that when you have these things that are fundamental to us, like the need for justice, the need for spirituality, the need for relationships, and I'll get to the fourth one in a minute, and you've got, say, several generations of playing out what that means. You know, and as the culture shifts, you have to renegotiate what that means for each generation. I mean, just take your imagination for a moment and cast it back. I know this is a ridiculous example, but it's the one that came immediately to mind. But just cast your mind back to the 16th century in England, where everybody worshiped the same, and everybody was connected to the same institutions, and everybody made money in a very obvious way. And you were born into a certain hierarchy. That's where you stayed, and that's where you made your life, and that's how you worshiped, and that's how you were connected to the land, on and on and on. And just take the religious dimension. And then the Reformation comes, and many of the institutions that were a commonplace to you were gone in less than a generation, over 10 years. The monasteries that were the key to religious life in medieval Europe were gone. Just, I mean, it would be akin to you're getting up next Sunday and finding out that all the churches in Northern Virginia were gone. Or at least the ones that you'd go to. They're just gone. What do you do with that? So my point is that when the culture shifts, these big, deep questions have to be negotiated in the society again. And people have to figure, and they come up with different answers. Wright's point is that there's a Christian answer to these questions. When the culture shifts, you got to go back to the fundamentals and rethink what it is we ought to do. Justice. Of what we ought to care about, spirituality. About how we ought to relate, the hunger for relationships. You got to figure all that stuff out again. I mean, like I mentioned last week, think of the last 50 years when we all left where we grew up. And we prioritized the nuclear family over the extended family. And we said yes to our children, go work in Washington State because that's where the really good job is. But if you're the one who went to Washington State and left all your family in North Carolina or Virginia or Maryland, you don't have Uncle so-and-so or Auntie so-and-so or Cousin Bobby to support you. It's just you in the suburban desert by yourself and your spouse and your 2 kids figuring it out. It's a different world. And so we spent the last 50 years how to live in that world. And now there's a lot of people, it started in the 90s when young people had a lot of money. But there's a movement now. Now I'm going to pick where I'm going to live first, and then I'll figure out how to make a living. Well, just think of how different that is from the way that my parents thought, for example, or I thought. So, all I'm trying to do is show you that the dial has changed, but the hub is still the same. And Wright wants us to see what the hub is so we can then make sense of how everything else connects, how all the spokes from our culture connect. The last one, and some people have had more trouble with this one than any other, which surprises me. But he talks about the fourth way that we hear the echoes of a voice is through beauty. Beauty. Now, I guess that's easy for me because I got this outside thing. I like outside. I'm not a big fan of inside. I really like outside. And I really like being outside where it's beautiful. It somehow makes a difference. Big difference. Now, there are all kinds of beauty. That's natural beauty I'm talking about, but there's all kinds of beauty. If you've ever been to a musical concert and just been overtaken by what you've heard, that's a kind of beauty. Sometimes you meet other people who, for you, their person is so beautiful you can't help yourself but be drawn to them. How many of you heard Lena Lavagna this week at church, the missionary? And you just listen to that soul. And you're like, wow, wow. There's a beautiful soul if we've ever met one. And you're just like. But now, here's the problem. You know that kind of soul is possible in the world. And you got to live with the knowledge that, hey, there's a gap here between me and that. There's a big gap between me and whatever that is. And so delight in beauty is really, really important. And Christians, one of the things I've been thinking about and trying to connect to a lot in the last year and a half is this idea of flourishing Christianly. And it all began for me in listening to a lecture by a Duke professor of divinity named Norman Wurzba, who wrote a book, simple book on the Sabbath. But then he invited us in this seminar to think about the Sabbath and what the Sabbath means. And he said, what was the pinnacle of creation? And we're all like, when he made man. He's like, no. The pinnacle of creation is the seventh day. Why? Because it says God rested. But here's the problem. What does it mean to say God rested? Well, what it can't mean is that God rested. Because God doesn't need to rest. God doesn't get tired. God doesn't, quote, take a break in being God. Right. He can't go to Cancun, right? God just doesn't go to Cancun. No. For a long time, we've understood that God's rest is in those words where he says, he looked at it all, and he didn't just say it was good that day, he said it was very good. In other words, it's like when your child does something, and it strikes you a certain way, and you say, well, honey, that's very good. God took delight in creation. Now, if that's true, and I think it is, if God took delight in creation, and we are made in his image, then it stands to reason, from at least the perspective of some, that we too should not be surprised that delight is part of the equation. Delight in the world, delight in creation. And when we see glimpses of it, what he calls echoes of a voice or glimpses of beauty that strike us in a way that demonstrates a distance between what we have or who we are and what that is, then that's an echo of God. When we're struck, I mean, I went to the Grand Canyon, drove 2.5 hours with 3 other friends. And when we got there, well, we only had 15 minutes. Clouds came in. The front was coming in, and we couldn't. 15 was enough. I got to go back someday because I've never seen the west of this country. I've never seen most of this country. I've seen more of Europe than I've seen of this country, and I have this deep longing to go do that. But I did get to see the Grand Canyon once for 15 minutes. And I'm serious when I say it's enough. I was like, oh my, and without getting in trouble with my grandmother, God. You know, you couldn't use the Lord's name in vain. My grandmother get you. And that's still very much with me. But when I say, oh my God, I mean it. What in awesome. Awesome. So these are the echoes of voices that he's going to try to help us get a hold of. And that will lead to a discussion about what's the core of the Christian story. And then with that, what does it look like if we're living in that story, if we're active participants in that story? And I find the book extremely helpful. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions about anything that I brought up? Please. Yes, Roger.
Well, I'd just say that I read the first 4 chapters, and he's a deeper thinker than I am. I'm far more practical oriented
Sure.
in some of his discussions as far as to what it really means.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to the rest of the book. But I certainly agree that he's probably nailed it with those four items he's talking about. You know, the heavens declare the glory of God.
Right.
And I like the outdoors too, and just the variety of creations, the mountains, the lakes, the rivers, the animals, the birds.
Right.
It's just fantastic.
Right. So that's, that's something I want you to, what I need to know when we meet next week, what made sense to you and what, more importantly, didn't make sense to you. What is he talking about when he says X? Please feel free to bring that to class next week.
When you mentioned beauty, I was thinking of this conversation that Tucker Carlson had when he went to Russia, and he says, that's a beautiful country. He says, you ought to go to those subway stations. They're absolutely gorgeous. He's into beauty.
Yeah.
And he equates beauty with character.
Yeah.
And you go to our subway stations, like in New York and whatever, it's a whole different. So, maybe the people of Russia are not our enemy. Russia's not really. I mean, they're beautiful people when you get to meet them. And beauty is important to determine that.
You can go to different countries at different points in their history and discover the high points of when beauty was valued. For example, you go to Britain and go to certain rail stations, and you're like, this is magnificent. We don't have anything like this. You talk about the Russian subways, when they built those, that they are, the way the architecture and the rendering that they have in the interior is extraordinary. You go to other countries, and you're like, I'll never forget my father-in-law came to this country, and particularly Virginia, and we're riding around. He couldn't get over the trees. I mean, we take trees for granted. But we are rich in natural beauty here in Northern Virginia. And the springtime is dazzling. So you can go to any place on earth and see both God-made and man-made beauty. I mean, I've stood in cathedrals in Europe and wondered what kind of faith could create this. Not mine, but they had something going on that they believed that intersected with their love of God that created those structures. I mean, they were phenomenal structures.
So the question is that still in our current life? Those kinds of people, and which were people that made all that stuff.
Well,
that's still.
My point is it changes over time. All of these things are still true. This is Wright's point. They're all true. It's just each generation has to find their way to it. You know, we have to find our way to it.
The most impressive cathedral I think I've seen is the one in Cologne, Germany, and they have 3 football fields, equivalent of stained glass.
Right.
All around. It's
right.
fantastic.
It's just staggering.
Just the architecture and how they could build it back then.
Right.
I'd like to talk about how things changed when we emphasized the nuclear family above the extended family. I lived in the same house, same street, same neighbors for 20 years. Nobody moved, nobody left. And then 6 years later, I took my mother to lunch, and I said, I'm moving to Texas. And she cried at the restaurant. I don't think I've ever seen her cry before or after, but I understand now why she cried.
So my point is that, and we just have to keep doing this, is we have to recognize that the world in which we live has shifted in ways that is radically different than where we were even 30 years ago. Yeah, Jeff?
I think the thing that people lose sight of, although history is replete with examples, is some things don't change, but life and generations always change, right? So when you're growing up with it, that's the new normal. Like my dad said,
right.
You can't raise your kids the same way that you were raised because society has changed.
Yes.
Right? And so
that is absolutely true.
It's human nature, I think, to fear things that are
different,
new and novel.
New. That's right.
Right? So I wish we could, I speak for myself as well, just maybe not be so apprehensive that the world is changing around me. Like, of course, and it's going to continue to do so. And if you came back in 100 years, you wouldn't recognize it.
Right. That's
and it
right.
doesn't necessarily mean that it's just going straight to hell.
Doesn't mean that it's bad. So here's another way to put it. Learn not to be anxious about change is one thing. But I think the spiritual key to not being anxious about change is humility. If we have a modicum of humility and don't think we've got all the answers, then we might have a minute to actually reflect on the core values of our faith and understand that, you know, the way we used to do it doesn't mean the way it has to be now. But what happens is well, if we can't do it like that, then we're not going to do it at all. And that's the equation that's killing us. If we can't do it like we've always done it, because that must be the right way to do it, then we're not going to do it at all. But it doesn't matter if that's your perspective, because the change is going to come whether you get on board or not. The key, I think, is with Wright to figure out, okay, how do we understand the core narrative that is the Christian faith? And then given the change, how would it apply here? Given the change, how would we live out the Christian faith in this situation? And I got to tell you, grace pops up and looks weird. I'm going to be preaching about it today. When grace pops up, when it comes out of the ground, and blowing like a geyser right beside you, then things are other than you assumed.